Grazie, Federico. Doesn't happen very often to have an Italian moderating an Italian session, so I'll take advantage of him pronouncing my name correctly. So, hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Valerio Magliulo. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Abatable. Today, I'm going to talk about how the stakes have never been higher with the climate crisis, the role that businesses can play, and how we at Abatable hope we can help. We are well within what many have called the decade of action. And that's because we're living through 3 unprecedented crises, and our window of opportunity is fast narrowing. Firstly, to put things in perspective, we have less than 10 years left before we exhaust our carbon budget, and our hopes to remain within 1.5 degrees of global temperature rises. That means we need to reduce our global emissions by 45% by 2030 to get there. And even if you look at 2 degrees increase, we're still at 30% emission reductions required. That is a monumental effort. We have not been able to reduce emissions year on year since the Paris Agreement. And so to get there by 2030 is going to be incredibly hard. But just looking at carbon sometimes doesn't allow us to see the bigger picture. There's about 1 million animal and plant species that are under the threat of extinction from climate change. Now, to put that into perspective again, we've only ever categorized about 1.2 million animal plant species out of the 8 to 10 million species that we expect to have and live on the planet. We're living through a biodiversity crisis that is unprecedented. And then finally, it's safe to assume most of us in this room are not going to be the ones who are going to pay the highest price of climate change. About 75% of climate-related income losses are expected to fall on the poorest 50% countries. Now, again, let me put that in perspective. Those 50% countries have only ever been responsible for 12% of global emissions, yet they are the ones who are going to pay the highest price of it. So we're living through an inequality crisis as well. I'll pause there. This is all very doom and gloom, but I hope most people in this room, and I think most people in this room are from businesses and organizations and speak the language of opportunity. So what's the opportunity here? If we look at current policies, we expect to get to 2030 nowhere near where we should be in terms of emission reduction to avoid our planet to warm for more than 2 degrees by the end of the century. That represents a massive opportunity for organizations and businesses to bridge that emission gap and lead the way and be part of the solution. Now, let me be very clear. The imperative for organizations is to reduce their emissions as much as possible first. The imperative is to invest in decarbonizing their own activities, work with the supply chain, and invest in low-carbon technologies. But that is not going to be enough. This is a monumental effort that's going to require a global transformation of our supply chains, of our energy production, of our infrastructure. And so the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their latest assessment has put out a fantastic chart which we've tried to make a little bit easier on the eye. And the message is really, what are the biggest mitigation opportunities that we have in order to get there by 2030 with those emission reductions? And they've identified several initiatives and actually estimated both what is the potential from a gigaton emission reduction perspective, but also from a relative cost of the technologies and those solutions. And the key thing that I want you to take away from this chart is truly that there are some technologies for which the cost is already quite affordable. And so we're talking about wind and solar. And so at a relatively low cost, we can get already a pretty significant emission reduction. But there's a lot of other solutions for which the cost is still prohibitively high. There are no financial incentives to carry out and complete these solutions without any other mechanism. And that's truly the role of carbon finance, to bridge that gap in terms of financing and help us support solutions such as carbon sequestration in agriculture, ecosystem restoration, fuel switching across our industries. Now, you might ask, so then why isn't every organization leaning into the carbon markets and engaging more meaningfully in financing carbon projects? It's a market that is still has many barriers for it to grow significantly. Firstly, it's very complex. there simply is a lack of alignment in terms of standards, in terms of communication, in terms of how we talk about carbon finance, carbon projects, and how we measure impact. And so without proper resources and knowledge in-house, that can be a daunting experience for any organization looking to lean into it. Secondly, we actually don't have any way to quantify, mitigate, and measure the risks that any organization may face when engaging with carbon finance. We're talking about reputational risk, we're talking about financial risk, we're talking about even political and jurisdictional risk in some cases. And then when you look at sort of the emission gap and those sort of 15 to 20 gigatons that we need to achieve in emission reduction by 2030, the market is still not able to deliver on that in terms of its size and its potential. And so a lot of organizations are struggling to understand how can they commit to a net zero future, how can they commit to a long-term carbon strategy without actually knowing that they can secure the right supply to achieve that. And finally, when you discard even all of this, there's still a lack of alignment on how we talk about the impact we're having. How do we measure this impact? What are the KPIs? And what are the claims that companies can make with carbon finance? So all of this makes for a very daunting experience when engaging with the carbon markets. And that's exactly why we've created Abatable. Now, as Federico was saying, Abatable is a carbon procurement and intelligence platform. Our mission is to empower every organization to build a thriving future for climate, nature, and people. And so to solve those three unprecedented crises we just talked about. Since founding Abatable and together with Ecosphere Plus, which joined our team earlier this year, we facilitated over 45 million carbon credit transactions. We've also helped channel over $180 million in critical carbon financing towards credible and impactful carbon projects. So how do we do that, you might ask? Firstly, we focus a lot on standardizing data. We think data is truly at the core of solving for the complexity in the market. So we look to understand project-level data, country-specific data, policy data, risk data, and really try to provide both the tools and the expertise to understand that data, digest that data, in order to make better decisions around carbon markets. Secondly, a very important focus of ours has also been on quality and integrity. And this is to ensure that carbon finance is truly going towards the most credible projects and the most impactful ones. And so we've developed our own way to assess these risks, mitigate these risks, and provide guidance to our clients and to the organizations we work with. We've also developed the largest database of carbon project developers. This spans all 6 continents, many countries. There's over 300 million tons available to be transacted on our platform. And that really allows every organization that works with us to find the right partner within carbon finance. And most importantly, to do so not just from a spot transaction perspective and from a one-off transaction perspective, but actually starting to think about the long-term purchase and how you're going to secure those carbon credits and support these projects on a longer basis. Finally, we also support you in understanding how to best communicate the impact you're having with all of the stakeholders in your network. That means impact reporting. It means transparent key performance indicators and impact metrics so that you can ensure that actually you're able to speak about the impact you're having more broadly. I'm going to address the elephant in the room, which is, if you've seen the news, if you read The Guardian or any other newspaper, the voluntary carbon markets are on shaky grounds and have been going through massive scrutiny, especially in the latter part of this year. And that's predominantly because of a lack of transparency, limited governance, and also misalignment of incentives across all the stakeholders, which has truly led to us channeling carbon finance towards project with, let's say, overstated impact. But we at Abatable are true believers in the power of carbon finance to bridge that emission gap, help us build that thriving future that we're talking about for climate, nature, and people. So if any of that resonates with you and you're keen to come build the future of the carbon markets with us, we're literally across the street from this booth, so you can't miss us. It's G30. You can see it through there. And thank you very much for coming. I think we have time for questions.
Yes, perfect timing. Thank you, Valerio, for the presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? You can raise your hand if you have a question.
Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. Can you talk a bit about your commercial model? Do you sell to larger corporates? How do you address these? Who do you talk to at your clients? And then how do you monetize the business model? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking a question. Thanks for coming. So predominantly, our business model is focused on a platform basis. So we actually charge our customers to access our platform, and rather than monetizing on a margin basis. And all of our transaction fees are based on the units that are facilitated to the platform and are transparently communicated both on the developer side, so on the supplier of carbon credits, as well as on the buyer side of the market. And so we are hoping that that brings a little bit more transparency in terms of this intermediation and all the margins that sort of keep adding up from the creation of carbon credits to the final retirement.
Just wondering that the projects have to set their prices, or there's a sort of variable market price. How does that work?
Fantastic question. So the question of pricing is one that comes up all the time. And the key challenge that we have is there's just still no clear correlation between prices of carbon credits and the quality and the risk of some of these projects. And so what we try to do is, by facilitating so many transactions and working across the spectrum of the industry, we provide market insights and intelligence to the developers that we work with so that they can better guide their price setting mechanisms. And we hope that over time that will mean that we can start seeing a convergence of prices towards something a little bit more rational.
Thanks for the presentation. Where do you get the data from? Most of the data, obviously, from the registries, they're open and accessible for everybody, but they are not enough, obviously, especially for the quality and the transparency. So can you shed some light on how you do that and what data you're asking? That's one. And then are you doing only nature-based or across the whole chain?
Thank you. So in terms of the solutions, I'll start with that. We're pretty broad, so we actually support any type of solution in the carbon markets. So when we talked about our developer database, we have over 4,000 developers across the market, which really covers pretty much every main registry. In terms of our data, we actually developed our platform in order to collect data directly from the project developers to facilitate their go-to-market with corporate buyers. That means that we have a very simple to use data collection tool for project developers where they can actually store their data to use directly with buyers, and that we can use to understand the risks, measure those risks, understanding the price in transactions, and provide those insights back to the developers.
Quick question on the data standardization that you talked about. Great that you are driving it with an Abatable, but any moves of driving standardization across the industry, across the globe, so that you can make projects really comparable and investable?
That is a great question. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we're facing today as a market, which is the lack of standardization across many different standards, registries, verification, and methodologies. And I think what we are trying to do is trying to sum up a lot of the impact the projects are having, a lot of those risks, into easily digestible data and insights so that we can hopefully inform a better way forward in terms of standardization. So we actively work with a lot of industry organizations such as IETA, ICRO, etc., and try to advocate for better data quality across the market.
Anyone else? We have time for a quick last question. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the presentation. Well, thank you, Valerio, for the presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, everyone.